Well, hello, everybody. Here at The Underneath, I have a very special guest with me this morning. Today, my mom, Judy. Judy, hello, how are you?
Fine.
Good, good. So, as many of you know, I have been sort of going through the phenomena of the Second Vatican Council. We talked about it from a theological standpoint. You know, I like to talk about it from a sociological standpoint, or what Charles Taylor calls the social imaginary. And I thought it would be great today to talk with you and my mom here about what the Second Vatican Council was like from an insider's perspective. So, Mom, welcome to The Underneath.
I'm happy to be here.
Yes, no, very excited. So, you know, just so my audience remembers, you know, I was born in 1973. Mm-hmm. So by the time I roll around, the changes from the Second Vatican Council, both in terms of the theology, but also in terms of the Mass, had already taken place. And so I do not know a church in the Pre-conciliar period. But you underwent almost all of your formation, if not all of your formation, prior to the calling of the Second Vatican Council, and you were in college then. So just real quick, I wanted to ask you, you know, about your first communion and what was life like for you as a small child, a younger child, and even through high school in the Pre-conciliar church.
It was beautiful. I attended Catholic school, as you know. Made my first communion. All the little girls wore veils. All the little boys wore suits, veils and white dresses. The little boys in suits. I remember the kindergarten students would go before us and throw little rose petals out, which was a very nice, very, very sweet thing to do. And we were prepared. We had been given a host, an unconsecrated host. You know, of course, it was on the tongue. It was, it was just a wonderful, beautiful time. You know, and I was happy to be in the church. My dad at that point was had come into the faith.
So Papa was a convert.
He was a convert, and you know, it was just, we were a very devout, close-knit family. It was my brother and myself, and we were daily communicants, and just really went to Catholic school, grade school, high school, and then college. And that was when the changes started.
Yeah. So obviously you went to Mass. It was in what we now call the TLM, the right. Traditional Latin Mass.
Right.
Yeah. And do you have any sort of memories of that?
Yeah. And I remember we had our missal, and there was Latin on one side and English on the other side. So we very much knew what was going on. We just followed along, and, you know, very much knew what was going on. But we were excited about the changes. We were excited that the Mass, parts of the Mass would be said in English. Always parts of the Mass were to be said in Latin. You know, we were all fine with that. We were all happy with that.
Sure. Okay. So when you went to high school, you went to an all-girls high school, Mount Carmel, right?
Mount Carmel Academy. I look back and I see I had a marvelous Catholic formation that many people do not have to this day. And even then, when I went to college from 1962 to 1966.
Okay, so in 1962, you're a college freshman at Loyola University in New Orleans.
Right.
And I know, just doing a little bit of background research, that Pope John the 23rd had called for the council, I believe, in 60? November of 59, actually. And so then there were a couple of years of preparation. And so that would have been called for in the middle of your high school career.
Yes. And we were very excited. We believed, these were historical times. Everybody loved John Paul. I mean, not John. And John.
We'll get to John Paul II in a minute.
John the 23rd. Everybody loved John the 23rd, because when I was a little girl, Pius the 12th was a very elderly, older man, but we could relate to John the 23rd.
Well, he was called like the smiling Pope.
Yes.
You know.
really enjoyed it, and we're very excited and thrilled about this Vatican II.
So before some hovering over this conversation, I think, is the election of John F. Kennedy. In
yes.
What was that? What must have been in November of '59.
Right.
He becomes the president. He's sworn in 1960.
Right.
So, just as a Catholic, can you remind us, like, what was that like to have gone from a time where it was just there's no way that we're ever going to have a Catholic president to we do? Right. So, what was that like for you as a young Catholic woman?
It was an extraordinary time. I still remember. I think I was a junior. Maybe a senior.
It would have been junior.
Junior. And us bringing the black and white, rolling the black and white TV in.
Wow.
TV set in to see him inaugurated.
Wow.
The first Catholic.
So this is like an event at the school. This is like a big deal.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the fact that now a Catholic could be elected president, it just meant we could be part of the cool kids.
Right.
Like we could be players.
Yeah.
We didn't have to stay in our little Catholic ghetto anymore.
Right.
We could be openly Catholic.
Sure.
And succeed.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you graduate high school, and the church is still the church of your childhood.
Yes.
All those sorts of things. So you're a college freshman in 1962.
Yes.
Which happens, of course, to be in October, actually.
Well, no, it's 63. Vatican II was from
You're right. So
October of 63 to whatever, I think May of or maybe just anyway 65. It was 63 to 65. So my college career bookended Vatican II.
So it spanned the Vatican. Okay,
yeah.
That's really interesting to me. Again, as someone who's been way after it all. What was it like what were you all hearing about the council? Like, what was the chatter about it? You're at a Catholic school.
Right.
Now, of course, you go from having Carmelite nuns in high school
to Jesuits.
Now you're with Jesuits. Right. So tell me a little bit about that experience.
Even in Jesuits were highly respected. They were, I hesitate to use the word liberal, but they were very informed. They were very savvy.
Sophisticated, maybe.
Sophisticated. They were very with it. And they were male, and I had always had female.
Oh, so that's going to be different. And of course, college is now co-ed.
Right.
Whereas you would go to an all-girls school with the uniforms and the
right.
Yeah.
Now, I want to say one thing before we continue.
Yeah.
There were some liberalizing tendencies that were coming in even then.
Okay, good. So
for example, we were told there probably weren't any wise men.
Okay. Sometime in high school, college, in that area. Okay.
Right.
So the wise men were sort of an apocryphal.
Yes. And that there were certain saints that they removed from the universal calendar, like Saint Philomena, like Saint Christopher.
Right.
With the notion that they might not have been even existed, which is not true. But,
I see.
But
So we would call that, of course, sort of stepping back from that, you're sort of modernizing modernist trends in scriptural appreciation.
But it was beginning to kind of, the rock of the faith was starting to get its little cracks,
Right, because I would imagine, again, I don't want to import too much onto you here, but if I hear that, I'm thinking to myself, well, what else? Right. Exactly. So was that kind of part of your thinking that sort of in the background, like what else is so the terra, the rock, the firma is sort of weakening ever so much.
A little, yeah.
Okay. So when you are so you're a freshman at Loyola, and you give me a sense of that there was an excitement about the council.
There was an excitement about it, just for Catholics. It was a very heady time to exist, and this idea that things were progressing to a good point, to a better point, right, was very much part of our thinking. Very much part. And I would think that was probably helped along by Teilhard de Chardin.
Okay. Oh yeah. I know. But go ahead.
We were progressing to an omega point.
Yeah, the omega point. That's right.
Yeah. And so that was part of the times. But we still had our solid liturgies, theology, to hold on to.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So socially speaking, you talk about this kind of optimism as a young Catholic. You've got a brand new Catholic president. And so your sense of the council was you sound to me like it was very hopeful and optimistic.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Okay, so what kind of news are you getting then as the council progresses? You know, the council meets in 63. It meets again in 64, and then it completes its work in 65. So what kind of like
we started getting, that there would be changes in the liturgy, that it would be translated into the vernacular. There were a lot of other liberalizing tendencies. For example, and before Vatican II, the fast to go to communion, the Eucharist, from midnight was reduced to 3 hours.
Just 3 hours.
3 hours.
So now, of course, it's 1, but
and then there's this further liberalizing of 1.
Okay. So practically speaking, that meant, as a kid, you would have gone to bed on Saturday night. Right. You woke up, got dressed.
Did not drink water.
In your Sunday finest, so no water, no food.
Right.
So you show up. I would imagine the masses probably were earlier then.
They had to be.
Yeah, right.
Nobody went to communion at noon.
Right.
I mean, I remember there was one woman who went to communion at noon, and it was like,
how did she do it?
Right. It was not unusual for somebody to sit through the entire mass, reverently, but not to go to communion.
Because they had broken the fast.
Right.
So the fast then was specifically to take the Eucharist.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And of course, we went from, during Lent, fasting, where you had the 2 small meatless meals and then a normal meal every day of Lent. Okay. Friday, of course, meatless all day.
Yeah.
And I did that for 2 years.
Oh, because you time into it at a certain age point, right? Yeah.
Right. And then all of a sudden, you don't have to fast anymore.
When?
When I was 22, that was the last year I fasted
for the Lent.
For Lent. Yeah, that was the last year. And they all said, well, you could do it on your own.
Right, which is also saying like you don't really have to do it. So therefore, practically speaking, nobody.
But no, we still had the Friday abstaining from meat
was pretty like rock solid.
But, pain of mortal sin.
Right.
Okay. So that went from you had to eat no meat on Friday to you could substitute a pious practice.
I'd say.
For that. So basically what happened is the Friday abstinence went completely out of the window, except for the Fridays of Lent.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now, you invoke mortal sin.
Right.
Now, as a post-conciliar child, that would have been a pretty hazy detail for me. I mean, now, of course, I know because I've done my studies and et cetera, the difference between a venial sin and a mortal sin. But that was very much part of your formation. You had that sensibility of a mortal sin. Now, again, for our audience here, what does it mean to be in a state of mortal sin?
To be in a state of mortal sin means that if you die, you go to hell.
Okay. And so therefore, how do you repair that state?
You go to confession.
Okay.
So confession lines were always
running.
Always running. And for an important feast like Christmas or Easter, because you had to do your Easter duty, you had to go at least once a year.
Right. To consume, you actually had to.
Right.
And that was in the Easter season. But anyway.
Yeah, but most people were trying to do it before Easter, And that all completely
went away.
Yeah.
And how was that conveyed to you? I mean, like what is the messaging structure? Like, now we would just go on Facebook and they would tell us this or something, but like, how is that conveyed to you?
The whole concept of mortal sin kind of, I wouldn't say it was changed, but it was suppressed.
Downgraded?
Yeah, it was.
It
was downgraded. Yeah. It just, it was like, in order to commit a mortal sin, you would just have to you would basically cursing God.
Yeah.
But anything up to that wasn't really mortal sin. And even there was another significant thing that occurred shortly after Vatican II, I think, because it was Paul VI that did it.
Because remember, Paul VI comes in, I believe, in the second year of the council. John dies after the first session.
And Paul VI
right.
finishes it.
Okay.
Removing, when you married outside of the church, you married you were a divorced person, or you were marrying a divorced person.
But you got civilly married.
Right. You were not only in a state of mortal sin, you were excommunicated.
Okay. Yeah.
And that was removed.
Okay.
Now you were still in a state of mortal sin.
Right.
But you were not excommunicated.
Okay.
And it here again, it was downgraded. It had a tremendous effect. And annulments, the annulment process was put into every diocese. And basically, in order for you to get an annulment before this time, you had to go to Rome. It was a 5-year process. And a lot of them
denied.
Right.
Yeah.
But and some people did go through the process, and it was wonderful that they were able to get into, back into the state of grace.
Yeah.
But the annulment process would put into the every
local
diocese. Right. So it did make it easier to do. And of course, look, I have your brother and my son, went through the annulment process, and I'm glad that it's there.
Yeah, of course.
But the easier something is to do, the more of it you're going to have.
Sure.
Yeah.
It maybe invites it on some level.
Right.
That's a practical reality, I suppose, of the situation. Okay, so just curious. I mean, you went to school with all Catholics, or mostly Catholics, right? Now we'll get into you marry a non-Catholic in 1968 after the council, but that's sort of a different question right now. But I mean, what kind of conversations were you having with your fellow friends about all this stuff?
Well, of course, I was in a Catholic school surrounded by Catholics, and so we had lots of conversations about what was going on. I was a person that tended to, if the church taught it, I accepted it, and I believed in it. That didn't mean I couldn't investigate and kind of give knowledge to why I believed something. But there were a lot of people beginning to pick it apart and question, and even teachers.
Okay, go ahead.
We're beginning to, that. And I could definitely see, I was born in 1944. I'm right on the cusp between the baby boomers
and the silent
and the traditional generation, the silent generation, the World War II generation.
GI generation.
Right, because I was born in the middle of World War II.
Yeah, you're a war baby. You and Dad are war babies.
Yeah. And which sort of unusual. But I'm trying to decide where I was going with this.
That's right.
Okay.
Well, I was asking you about your conversations you were having with friends.
Okay.
And
so they were willing to. Okay. Oh, I know what I wanted to say, because this is important.
Yeah.
I can literally look behind me, the kids coming up 2 years after me, and seeing a sea change. That was the bell bottoms, the long straight
hair.
The hippie movement. I went from being in college where you didn't wear shorts on the college campus. Girls did not wear shorts on the college campus, to anything goes. You could wear anything you want.
Jeans,
it was
shorts.
A sea change, in a 2-year span.
So you're literally a senior then in 1965, looking at the freshmen and sophomore, being like, who are they? Like, what's going on?
What's going on? And even the teachers began to be much more liberal.
Interesting.
Yes.
It's just in terms of affect and dress and approach.
And what they were actually
intellectually.
Teaching.
Okay. Right. All right.
Because you see, everything was being questioned there. Everything was kind of, you had these small changes. What else was up for grabs?
Right. So you can almost kind of see where, with these sort of little changes kind of on the periphery, the essentials are still essentials, but it starts to sort of have an encroachment on what we may call the majors. You could talk about the minor stuff, but now it has a way
into deeper and deeper stuff.
Like we might say core stuff.
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something
yeah,
like that.
and especially moral theology.
Okay, yeah, okay. Maybe we can go back to the moral theology in a minute. So, look, you're a Catholic young woman, and certainly at the time, the expectation is automatic, of course, that a vast majority of young men and women get married sometime, either probably at the end of college or right after college, right?
Or sometimes in the middle.
Or so, yeah, so I'm saying sometimes in the middle of college. You have friends who were married in the middle.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Some finished college, some didn't.
I see.
I was able to finish college,
Yeah,
and then get married. Yeah.
right. So, I mean, look, hovering over all of this conversation is contraception.
Yes. Oh, it was a huge issue.
So,
And this was the big. This is what was really being chipped away.
right. So, what's fascinating to me about this, of course, is that nowhere in the documents of the Second Vatican Council is there even any mention of family planning or contraception.
Right.
And yet, in terms of like, it's almost like extra conciliar chatter is about this, which makes total sense. You're a young person, you're looking to get married. This is an issue that cuts right at the core of your understanding of yourself as a young Catholic person,
Right.
to get
And
married.
you see, the pill had just gained steam. And the church even, they formed a commission to study it. What could you use the pill morally?
Right. So that now the church doesn't officially make a pronouncement until 68. Right. But prior to that, so I want to, so what is that like? I mean, you're a young intellectual, college student in this time.
Right. Well, the expectation really was that the church was going to change. The church was going to change it.
Who told you that? So what do you mean the expectation?
Well,
because certainly the Vatican didn't say anything about it yet.
No.
Right.
No. Right. Let's see. Dad and I got married in 1968, and I was and in anticipation of us getting married, I had already started taking the
right. Pill. So that's interesting to me because, like I said, you're an active Catholic. You're not a lukewarm kind of cultural Catholic. Like you take this stuff seriously.
Right.
Did a priest tell you that this was kosher, or like what was that like?
People started priest shopping.
Interesting. Well, what do you mean by that?
You started looking at, some priests would say no, absolutely not. Some priests would say, well, maybe, it's all right. It was a time of confusion.
Ambiguity, maybe.
Ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And let's see, we got married August the 7th. I think it was the very end of July that the Pope Paul's encyclical
Humanae Vitae
came out.
Wow. So this is like a month before you're getting married.
Right.
So this is decision time.
Yeah, yes. Now, and that was when theologians started attacking it and saying, the Pope is wrong and
so okay, wow. All right. I mean, now that's pro forma, right? I mean, everybody disagrees with the Pope, right? Nobody sort of believes that that's an eye.
But that's what opened up that whole Pandora's box.
So you are now watching adult Catholics, theologians, teachers, priests
questioning it.
Say out loud, fine, Pope Paul, but no.
Right.
So what does that do to your conception of the church, the papacy, all of that?
I was basically told you have to follow your own conscience.
Okay, so conscience.
Now, what is a young woman who wants to get married? And her husband, would like to avoid a pregnancy for just 6 months was all Dad wanted. 6 months, And so I stayed on the pill.
Mm-hmm.
And in God's mercy, a month after we were married, because we came back from a honeymoon, and because I was on the pill, you're supposed to go back to the doctor just to get.
I see. Okay.
And the doctor finds a lump in my breast.
Wow.
And I'm going to have a biopsy. Wow. And if the biopsy is malignant, I will have to have a mastectomy. It was a real wake up call.
For sure. And why did you connect that to the pill? Well,
they said it was probably estrogen fed.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay. Now, we have a history of breast cancer in our
Mhm.
family.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I had the biopsy. It turned out not to be, malignant. But at that point, I said, the church, the official position of the church is contraception is wrong, including the pill. I believe what Humanae Vitae says is that every marital act must be open to life.
Sure.
That doesn't mean it will automatically, because natural family planning is valid.
Mhm.
But I just said, no, I'm not going to do this.
And that's an interesting prompting of the Holy Spirit. Would you say that
Right.
you? Because I would assume many of your friends.
Kept doing it.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Again,
Yeah.
I'm not offering this as in the spirit of judgment, but
right.
rather than
But
practically
I am
speaking.
grateful that God gave me that grace, because I think if I had kept compromising and kept going down that path, I think our family would be in a very, very different place now.
Mhm.
But I think the fact that I was willing to look, I'll pay the price. I'm Catholic.
Sure.
You have to be different to be Catholic, and I will do that. And I think that was what ultimately drew Dad, into the faith.
Right, because in 1968, when you and Dad got married, Dad was not Catholic.
Right.
And he really was nothing.
That's
right.
correct. That's correct.
I know his
How
father's.
did he put it? He said his dad was Jewish and his mother was a part-time Presbyterian.
Yeah. Well, no,
He had not been baptized.
Right.
But he had gone to a Catholic school, and that was where I met him.
Right. That's right. So okay, so that's a pretty countercultural thing for you to do, to get married to a non-Catholic, right?
Yeah, particularly somebody as
devout and at least open to changing something as personal as taking the pill, taking contraception.
Right.
So you were not a what I would say a frivolous Catholic.
Right.
So but so I've never actually asked you this, but like how did that go in terms of your wedding prep? I mean, how did this work? What were the priests telling you and Dad?
They were telling us that that the Pope was about to issue this encyclical, and it could go either way, but most of them felt like it was going to be changed.
No, I know that. I'm sorry. So just in terms of you're a Catholic, you're marrying a non-Catholic.
Right.
I mean, 10 years prior to that, would have been.
It was
crazy.
A lot easier to do at that, and that was other things that were liberalized.
Right.
You could marry a non-Catholic in church, and I'm not talking like in the church.
In the church itself, yeah.
Because like my mother married a non-Catholic, she got married at home.
Wow.
The priest came, but they could not marry in the church building.
Wow.
You either got married in the rectory or the sacristy.
Wow.
Or you could marry at home.
Wow.
But because things had been liberalized, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, no, I'm not, again, not in the spirit of judgment. Now, this is just an interesting time capsule.
Yeah, that we were able to marry in church. We had a lot of priests blessing us. We knew the priest that married us. And even I had a first cousin who was an Episcopal priest and eventually became a bishop, and he was there.
Oh,
he was on the altar and gave me a blessing.
Again, 10 years. Yeah. No way that would have happened 10 years earlier.
No.
Yeah.
And I just don't even know if I could have gotten past marrying a non-Catholic.
That's kind of what I'm. Yeah, that's my. Right. So were there any conditionals put on you and Dad because he was a non-Catholic? I mean, what was the?
We had to get, because Dad had not been baptized, we had to get an extra layer of permission to marry.
And did he have to agree to raise the kids Catholic or something like
and
that?
he had no problem.
Yeah,
Yeah, he was perfectly willing to do that.
Right.
And he said, and I think this is interesting, he said, it is the mother that conveys the faith. And he said, I will assist. I will help you. Just don't ask me to convert. And I thought that was very, very fair, and Dad was, when we would travel, the first thing he would do was look up the mass where I could get to mass.
That's so Dad. That's so Dad. Yeah. Always a man of duty and responsibility. I know that's instructive. Okay, so you all get married now. Now I want to talk a little bit about liturgy. So in 1968, when you and Dad get married, at that point, the new mass is still not a thing.
That's right. But it had been translated into.
So the liturgy is now primarily, is it in
It's
English?
in English. Yeah, they're part. The main. What is it? The the
Canon.
main part. The canon is. But all the responses, everything is in English.
But so it's just a it's
just a
it's
translation
the mass of it's the old mass translated into
Right.
English with certain parts still in Latin.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then and so therefore, but is the priest ad orientem or ad populum?
The priest is facing away from the congregation.
Okay. So
yeah.
ad orientem still,
Right.
even at that point.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So you all get married in the church. It is a
Mhm.
translated mass.
Right.
Are you kneeling in front of the altar?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you receive communion at
He did not. Dad did not, but I did.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so you get married. Okay.
Mhm.
And what, a year and a half, Mark shows up in 1969.
That's right.
My older brother Mark.
Yes.
Okay. So, and I would imagine that's a blur. You're newly married, basically. You have a new child, and there's all of this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But so in 1969, Pope Paul VI promulgates the new mass in Advent of 69, which is interesting because it's only a month before Mark is born.
Right. But it had not come down. It took a little while for it to come down, to be brought fully into, and it was in the 70s, early 70s. I mean, it might have been
71,
something like that. Yeah.
I know some dioceses where it was a little bit slower of a rollout.
Right.
But by 71, it's pretty much.
Yeah. Now you had to go through an adjustment to have it, the translation, the English translation. Okay. Now you're having to go to another adjustment.
Right. So you lived through the translation, and then a few years later, you're now living through a whole new thing. Now, I'm just curious. Like, what was it like to all this thing that you grew up with, right?
Right.
I mean, it's magisterial. It's vertical. It's ancient. It's Latin, and you've got the translation, but still.
And I'll tell you, and I was not a trad.
No, I know.
But this is honestly when I'm experiencing the new mass. They never know when to quit. that was my. I was kind of. It sort of popped in your head. In my brain. Yeah. It's like, okay, we went through this one change, and now we're going through this. Now I would say that it was after that the bottom fell out.
Okay. So we're roughly talking let's call it 71.
Yeah, 70-ish.
70-ish. Okay, so the bottom falls out. Well, please flesh that out for your son here. Please.
Everything is up for grabs. The rosary is out.
I mean, really downplayed, right?
Yeah. But that's when I don't know how long it took, but they started, renovating the
chapels, the
altars, and pulling out the altar so that it could be said facing the congregation. The tabernacle was put to the side, or it wasn't even there. It was like, where's the tabernacle?
Yeah. Whereas before, just so my audience understands that, the altar is sort of the focal point, and then right above the altar is the tabernacle, and right above the tabernacle is the crucifix. Yeah. Right, it's sort of this vertical, this sort of through the priest, through the altar, up to right. So is this sort of, and
even at a certain point, that wasn't right away. The altar rails disappear. And that was another step. We go standing, and on the tongue still. We go standing.
Okay.
The altar rails disappear.
Wow.
And then eventually communion in the hand.
Tell me a little bit about that. Okay. So you were 28, 29,
maybe 26, 27.
Before you were 30. So for 30 years,
two of you at that point.
Right. So for 30 years,
you couldn't touch it.
Yeah, right.
Now, one thing that was beautiful to me is I became a Eucharistic minister.
But that was later, and I want to get to that later because I actually remember that moment when you and Dad did that. But anyway.
Because I remember one of my favorite saints was Saint Tarcisius.
Mm-hmm.
he was a little boy. He had been given the Eucharist in a package. This was in the time when when the Christian church, you were a martyr if you were discovered.
Yeah, yeah.
And he had this little package, and some ruffians on the street thought it was something valuable.
Oh, right.
And they literally beat him to death, but he wouldn't surrender
the Eucharist.
The Eucharist. Yeah. And I just always loved
the preciousness of
the Eucharist. Yeah. But this was coming from the highest levels of the church. I didn't question it. I didn't.
Yeah, no, I don't think I would have either. I just would have been listening.
Right. I think I looking back, I kind of missed the mystery. I missed the reverence. It just seemed like, everything was kind of slappy, happy, hippy.
Yeah, the word that keeps coming into my head as we have this conversation is like casual.
Yes. Oh, the attire dropped off the radar.
Right. And of course, this is everywhere. This is not just Catholic.
Right. The attire dropped off you didn't wear a hat anymore. You didn't wear a veil anymore.
Right.
And Father Groeschel, I was listening to him years ago, and he said, well-to-do Catholics dress the way they're coming back from the beach. He said, lower class Catholics dress like they're going to the beach. Yeah. But he said the upper class Catholics dress the way you come home from the beach. It was like there was just it was really sad. To me, the least we can do for our Lord is dress like we care.
Yeah, it's funny, and I know this conversation is not really about me, but I remember at a certain point, one of the things we heard all the time from religion teachers was, and my formators, such as they were, was, don't worry about it, come as you are. That was kind of the ethos of it. And I recall when I became a father, it occurred to me that I probably should come as I should be, not as I am, right? That there's some sense that I should
go to a little effort.
Well, right. Yeah, and so so I don't know if you knew this, but a couple of years ago, and this is very me, I suppose, but I made the conscious decision that, look, if I have to wear a tie for work, the least I can do is wear a tie for Jesus. And so I do. For Sunday Mass, I put on a tie, I wear a blazer unless it's 100 degrees out, and it's a little bit of a discomfort to have to put the tie back on, but it's the least that I can do if I'm receiving my Lord in the Eucharist. So, but that was in this time period that you're talking about, that was totally passé.
Right. Oh yeah. You dressed like you were coming home from the beach.
I love it. That's very funny.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the changes. These are going on, and you said to me the other day that something that kind of stuck in your craw was the sort of the watering down of the kind of the moral aspect or code of the faith. And you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, like I said, it became almost impossible to commit a mortal sin. And I'm grateful that I was off the market, the dating market, when that it took hold.
Right, because you could see the sexual revolution would just run roughshod through all these sort of things.
Yes. And everything just seemed to go to hell in a handbasket. And it was probably, I don't know whether the hippie movement grew out of what was happening in the faith, or the hippie movement was infusing what was happening in the faith. But everything, kids were on the pill, they were sleeping around. Abortion was that whole conversation.
It becomes legalized, right? It
1973 is
exactly. I jokingly, darkly joke that I'm a 1973 survivor since I was born in 73.
Right. Yes. And you started having books without imprimaturs that were using a completely different criteria for what was
considered a sin,
a mortal sin or sinful.
We call it situational ethics, that we call it.
Yes. It had a lot to do with the yeah, the circumstances.
Yeah.
And it was, there was one, it was, is there good fruit coming from it? And that's still with us today.
Oh yeah, I mean that's the church that I grew up in.
Yeah. And I would say that the ambiguity that I experienced in the 70s, that John Paul II and Benedict stabilized and were marvelous at that. Pope Francis comes, God rest his soul, but all that confusion, all that ambiguity is right back.
Right.
And I don't think it's good.
Yeah, no, I don't either. Well, look, before we get to Pope Francis, and that's fine. We can take the discussion in that direction. I don't mind either. But okay, so so this is at the tail end of Paul VI, the sort of the second half of his papacy, is post-conciliar.
Right.
We've got a new mass. We've got the downplaying of these popular pieties like the Rosary and novenas and First Friday devotions,
emptying statues from the
altar, from the sanctuary.
Then when new churches, oh my Lord, when the new churches were built, I mean, we're going to look back on this season as like, what were we thinking?
Yeah, I talk about it as comparable to the kind of
the stripping of the altar,
the stripping of the altars in the English Reformation, and I think it's comparable ultimately to the French Revolution, in which you have this and an attempt to establish a kind of year zero. And so the sensibilities of that decade, again, let's go roughly from 68 to 78, when John Paul II comes in. This is a period of intense iconoclasm, almost literally, but I think also sort of spiritual, a kind of spiritual iconoclasm.
Stripping of.
So what was the attitude then of the old ways versus the new ways?
Well, we are, like you I think you mentioned it. There were always these really, really cranky trads. I didn't identify with them, but I did identify, I guess, with conservative Catholics who believed in the church's teaching on moral theology, on doctrine, all that sort of thing. And at this point, I get involved in the charismatic movement, but under Father Harold Cohen.
A Jesuit priest from Loyola.
A Jesuit priest, but completely different from the average Jesuit priest that you run into today. He was so, what the church taught was the truth. It was real. That's right. You could trust it. And he was so excited when the catechism was,
But you're getting ahead of yourself. You're getting ahead of yourself, right? Because that's later on.
Yeah. So, but this is still this time of.
So in the period of ambiguity and confusion, you find your way to the charismatic renewal.
Yes, and an experience.
What does that mean for you? Yeah.
Okay. I think it's I went through the charismatic movement. There are other ways to go through it, but it was I was raised Catholic. But now I had to own it. I had. It was yours. It was it's not because of my parents. It's not. It's because of me. Do I believe this? Do I accept this? Do I? And I came to know Jesus not as an historical figure, but as my Lord and my Savior, and I was walking with him and talking with him on a daily basis. It was a beautiful time. And this is, this is right before you were born, is what Mark was. It was in the early months of 1970, and Mark was born, as you know, in December of 69. So this was a very key and critical. And Dad was still not Catholic, and I was really on the verge of just letting go.
Really?
I told our Lord, I said, if you're real, please show me. Otherwise, it would just be easier to walk away.
Sure. Because you have this intense personal relationship experience through the charismatic renewal. So you're like,
but no, that was what came in.
Oh, okay.
And this is how the Lord answered my prayer.
Wow. Oh, okay.
This is how the Lord answered my prayer. So I started reading the Bible, and teachers who were teaching scripture Not that, you know, like, what did you say when you were speaking with Amy Wellborn? We're going to study this book, but he might not have been, he might not have written it, you know, and it might not have ever happened.
Basically the downstream versions of the higher criticism,
right.
the sort of, the
Right.
sort of,
Right.
you know, the book of J and the, you know,
just tearing it apart so that you don't have to listen to it, you know. But the Lord was allowing me to read it with seriousness. Mm-hmm. And starting to penetrate it, starting to understand it. Mm-hmm. And so that when these things started coming into the church that were clearly not
biblical, for sure, but also not traditional,
or you know, not the hierarchy or the magisterium, I was fortified to be able to say, well, you know, I don't believe that,
because you're reading scriptures.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. All my memories of you, it's very funny, you know, all my memories of you, because we would go from time to time with you to the prayer meetings.
Right.
But my memories of you, you know, in that period of my childhood is that, you know, you number one, you prayed. Right. You know, there was a period of time every day in which you prayed. Right. And from my memories, you know, you had your Bible. Mm-hmm. And you were like marking passages and praying them, and you had the scriptural rosary.
Yes.
Which is just say right there.
Yes. Yes. I would like people to see it. Yeah. Yes.
So you have, sorry everybody. Mm-hmm. So you have this book, you know, this book called the Scriptural Rosary. So I have a memory of you can hold it, you know, with this book, with your rosary, and your scriptures, and that was part of your sort of your prayer routine.
Yes. Yeah. Well, somebody told me I needed to pray an hour a day, which is not easy to do when you're having children. Babies. Yeah. Right. And it was like my mother had this in her house. She had bought it.
Wow.
And I said, wow, that would take up 15 years.
That's great. Well, I could chunk out 20 minutes in this hour, you know.
So I started using this scriptural rosary. I credit it with saving my faith.
Wow.
You know, and as do you think your audience knows that my son's wife, Demetra, her dad put this together.
Wrote it, published it, which is a funny story because later on when I met, you know, when I met John for the first time, you know, I went to Deemy's house to meet the parents and all that sort of stuff. Deemy had mentioned to me like, oh, you know, my dad like publishes this book, whatever, and I'm like, wait, I know that book. That book has been in my house since I knew what a book was. So anyway, I don't want to make this an advertisement yet, but anyway.
It was interesting that he would then marry,
but you know,
daughter.
But a rosary, of course, is passé at this point. But you had thrown yourself back into scripture, and all of that. So that sort of, for you personally, that sort of stabilized some of this ambiguity.
Yeah, and of course, as you know, Dad, it became Catholic.
When Mark got his first communion, right?
When Mark was making his first communion, Dad was, you know, hearing him his catechism, and you know that he would be prepared, and he wanted to be able to go with Mark. Yeah. But he said, I think it's too late, because this was probably maybe in February, March. And Mark was going to be, it was going to be April the 2nd was going to be when he was going to make his first communion. And this was before RCIA existed. Yeah. And a nun, Sister Colombier, precious Irish nun, came to the house to pick something up. Mm-hmm. And Dad was there. It was a Saturday. He was there, and he told her the story. And she goes and she tells the deacon, whom we knew. Yeah. We had gone to Loyola with him. Mm-hmm. And when Dad goes to Mass that day, he was going to Mass with me.
At that point,
not of course, to communion. Jerry Martinez shakes Dad's hand, and he says, "Congratulations, Mike. I understand you want to become a Catholic."
I love it. The hard sell. I love it. He's like,
So in the 2 or 3 months that they had, Dad was able to become
to
Catholic.
receive.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And the day before Mark went to communion, his first communion, Dad, my husband, Mike, was baptized, confirmed, and made his first Holy Communion.
Wow. Wow.
At a 5:30 evening mass.
I remember that,
on
yeah.
a Friday.
I mean, I was a little tight, but I remember. I remember.
Right.
Because Josh at that point was a toddler.
Oh, he was 18 months old.
Yeah.
So that was a wonderful, beautiful.
Okay, so story time is over, people. We're gonna go back to the.
Right.
No, that's fine. I love it. This is perfect. This is perfect. Okay, so then this new mass.
Right. Yes. Where they never knew when to quit.
Right. So this new mass comes along, and what was your sense of that? Like, did you feel like, because at this point, again, for folks in the audience here, the Latin mass had been completely memory hold, except for a micro,
a little
sliver,
right.
of a thing.
Yeah.
Did you think about the mass?
No, I life moved on. I was still. Once you all got into school, I was a daily communicant, and I could even remember dragging the three of you sometimes to mass. And most of the time, we would spend most of the mass outside.
Right.
And then I would come in and go to communion, and then we would go home. But I was trying. I wanted to, and I think God blessed that.
Oh yeah.
And I think blessed you all through it.
Yeah.
But I accepted it, and if it's done reverently and well, I have no problem.
Yeah. No, and I don't mean to turn this into a TLM versus the Novus Ordo grudge match here.
But I do understand why people are drawn to it.
Okay, so Paul, so in the second half of Paul VI, pontificate, he basically was the darling of the ball until he publishes Humane Vitae.
Right.
And he's sort of an embattled figure through that period of time. Even makes that quip, I guess we would say. Maybe it's apocryphal, I'm not really sure, but that the smoke of Satan had entered through the cracks.
There were cracks in the church and the smoke of Satan was entering into the church. He saw what was happening as a result of the loosening of everything. But it's like, how does it go? How do you shut the barn door, shut the door once they're out? It's too hard to do it.
Okay. Okay. So meanwhile, you're sending us to Catholic schools.
Right.
What was religion instruction like?
Well, we were and I didn't realize it, but we were in a little bubble.
Okay.
Because we had the Irish nuns.
Right. Just so the audience knows, we were members of a parish. We had a parish school that was actually staffed by habited nuns. It was a modern habit, but there were 5, 6, 7 nuns, and we were pretty friendly. But we had them over for dinner and stuff.
Precious. They were precious.
And so you feel like they kind of stabilized things?
They were not infected with the feminist gene.
Oh, interesting.
Because that was when the American nuns were pouring out of the convent, and then the ones that were there weren't. they
were much part of the revolution.
And look, there were wonderful nuns even then, but they paid a price to stay faithful. Lots of times they were the pariah in their order, but that was when the nuns got rid of habits. You kind of knew they were nuns because they wore a cross and they had short gray hair and a pantsuit.
Kind of the classic stereotype.
But our nuns they were just precious and dear, and I didn't realize how much we had not experienced, and we were in a very conservative archdiocese.
Okay.
That we had Archbishop Hannon.
So there were real variances then. From diocese to diocese in terms of how much was implemented, quote unquote. So we go to school, go to Catholic schools, and you probably didn't think too much in terms of our catechism because you just
No,
assumed...
I didn't worry about it at all. You know, not at all until the fateful day when you showed me the book.
Yeah. Okay. So we moved from New Orleans to Baton Rouge when I'm in 5th grade.
Yes. Yes.
And so when we, so we changed schools, obviously, we went to the Catholic school, and then we go on to Catholic High, and at some point though, you become a religion teacher.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Remember at MBS. Yeah.
So what was your experience of that? So now all of a sudden, now you're like a teacher. You're dealing with DREs. You're dealing with pastors.
Right.
What is that?
And
like?
I'm beginning to pick up the incredible liberality of, and I'm not an old fogey.
No, not at all. No.
But I begin to see the incredible liberality of what's going on, specifically in the what would you call it, the professional class.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
I mean, I was shocked. I remember.
What kind of stuff? Give the audience.
There was a class that I had to take from the diocesan level on human sexuality. If you were going to have anything to do with students, you had to take this class.
Got it. Okay.
So I go to the class, and I'm being told that homosexuality is like having blue eyes, which means it's a less dominant gene, but it's naturally occurring.
Therefore.
Right. And so that was the first thing I objected to.
You're like, hold on a second. I know the Bible pretty well here.
Right.
This seems to be a break from the tradition at the very least.
I don't believe in being ugly to people, mean or anything like that. But this is 2,000 years of and before of church teaching. But anyway, and then this is when I really lost it. She's talking about IVF.
Wow.
And she quotes the father of the first IVF child, which was Louise. I think her name was Louise Brown, but it was baby Louise. She had been conceived this way, and I think he was a minister. The dad was a minister, and he said, "I know, IVF is possibly wrong," but he said, "But when I see my daughter, I just can't believe she's wrong." Well, of course,
there's nothing wrong with the baby.
The baby, right. A child conceived out of wedlock, it's everybody else's, sin, not the baby's sin. But anyway, so I raised my hand, and said, I said, I came to this class to find out what the church teaches. And she says, well, this is a graduate level class, and I have to think for myself. And I said, and it just popped out of my mouth. I said, I didn't come here to hear what you thought. Oh. I came here to hear what the church teaches. Yeah. Well, you could have heard a pin drop in the class. I was clearly the skunk at the at the garden party.
Yeah, that's right. That's like, oh, we have a live one here. They're hitting the panic button. Right. Oh no, we've got an old. But again, I think that would have been true. It's like, oh, Judy, she's like a pre-Vatican II
Catholic. Yes, yeah. Right. But that was when I began to realize, and I said, these are the people that are going to be going into all the Catholic schools in the diocese and teaching. Yeah. And they're not going to be teaching Catholic doctrine. Yeah. They're anyway.
Yeah. So okay. So now that
was in the 80s.
Yeah, that heady time again from 1970 to 1980, it's crazy time. Again, from my perspective, this is sort of crazy time. So John Paul II gets elected in 1978.
Right. Yes.
Now, one of my early memories is I'm sitting in the living room and you're watching the TV.
Yes.
And you're watching the smoke. habemus papa moment.
Right.
And I remember them saying Carol Wotiwa or whatever.
Right,
I remember thinking,
right.
it's such a funny name.
Yeah.
Why is he named Carol? Like,
Yeah.
But anyway, okay, so John Paul II is elected, and what was that? I mean, early on, again, I know what we think of him now, but like, what do you think then?
He was first of all, we had the strange of the Pope lasting a month.
John Paul I.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then he's not Italian.
Right.
So
that's strange.
But kind of heavy, here, historical, and then he comes out. I think he had us all when he came out on the balcony and said, "Be not afraid."
Yeah. Beautiful.
Because he knew we were afraid.
Yeah.
Of
course.
And
he knows that he's a pastor.
Yeah, you read about him. He was athletic. He was
skiing.
He loved the polka when he was when he was young, and it was just. It was such you just felt like you could
interesting
breathe. It was going to be all right.
But the professional theological class did not care for that poll. So when did you catch wind of that?
I remember there's a wonderful teacher, Ralph Martin.
Oh yeah.
And he started producing videos and teachings about
cassette tapes.
Cassette tapes. About just nailing what was happening in the church. That there were people that were, fudging, obfuscating, and he said even things like misplaced priorities. He said, worrying about the baby seals being killed, but not the baby human beings that are being killed.
The pro-life movement was a significant part of this.
Yes, and abortion. I had to go through a process with that.
Talk us through it. I mean, that's okay.
I always thought abortion was wrong, but then what is it? Roe versus Wade comes out in 1973, and there are all kind of Catholics who are supporting, abortion and everything, and I'm like, and I'm married to a non-Catholic at the time. He doesn't, it doesn't really matter.
Neither here nor there for him.
Right. And I really had to kind of go through steps, and I finally got to the point where I said, okay. God has given us the church to teach us the truth, to guide us. And they have said for 2,000 years, this is wrong. This is murder. And I am going to go with that.
Yeah.
And
which makes you a weirdo.
Yeah. And it was a wonderful decision that I made. And here again, I think I had the grace of God to make, and I think that had a tremendous.
You're fine. I just want to make sure I don't need to block the mic.
Right. That I think it affected you all. That Mom was willing to make a stand on something that's not very popular and hold to it.
Yeah. No, it definitely registered with me.
Right.
That this was a real thing. This was no small, again, casual thing to be just discarded.
And I began to realize you can't be one of the players.
Okay, right.
You can't be you can't be part of the cool kids.
Yeah.
You can't, you have to, I mean, if that happens here and there, fine, but it's not going to always happen. You're going to have to be different to be Catholic and to follow your Lord and Savior.
Yeah, what's so interesting to me, of course, then Cardinal Wojtyła's book, Love and Responsibility.
Yes.
But he also,
the whole theology of the Bible.
Well, right. But also the idea of just being a sign of contradiction.
Yeah, sign of contradiction.
Like that was something that I internalized fairly early on in my young, as I'm sort of being formed by all this. The Pope is calling us to be a kind of sign of contradiction. That was a big.
That was huge for me. Huge for me. Yes. That you were always going to be countercultural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I internalized that. So now, but John Paul II, it was interesting because as I remember it, sort of, because again, I'm sort of just coming into consciousness, really, is that he was beloved by the people, but not so much by the professional class.
Right.
The bishops and the DREs and the nuns and the priests.
They had a real problem, with him.
Because he was saying different things than the spirit of the Vatican.
But then it was simple because, the Pope was saying it, and of course we've had a recent experience with a different kind of Pope. But it was just like you have said. I've listened to a lot of your podcasts.
She's a fan.
I'm a fan. Yeah. He was our hero. He was our, and I loved him, and I love Benedict equally, if not a little more.
Yeah. So I remember in high school, a real watershed moment. Because as part of my own unraveling. My sort of petulant, putting you through another dark night, was my religious formation, and all of my religion teachers in high school were progressives.
Yes,
all of them were modernists.
Yes.
All of them, we were. And I remember I brought you something from my textbook, and in the textbook it said something like, well, the resurrection probably happened. But
all of his other miracles were sleight of hand tricks.
Yeah. And I remember I sort of like showing you that, and I was not,
I didn't believe you. I said, I don't
crazy.
believe it.
I was like,
and you got the book.
Yeah, and I showed you the book, and that really did precipitate in me personally my own, what we would call now a kind of deconstruction, or at least an unraveling of the faith. And so, I left. I said, I'm not Catholic anymore, sometime in the middle of my high school career. And, I wind up reconverting. I don't know what you want to read. I read my way back into the church as a college freshman, and then decided.
I can remember you and I had a couple of
fights,
heated conversations. And I remember just praying, Lord, lead him to the truth, whatever that is. Lead him to the truth. And I really sat back and watched you go back. Come back in a more mature way.
Yeah, for sure. And I think again, not to toot my own horn, but an interesting sort of way, I think I sort of precipitated a renewal
in the whole family, with all your brothers. With Mark, and then you go into this wonderful Thomas More.
I go to Thomas More, and then really kind of for me, it wasn't until I went to Thomas More that I experienced two things sort of simultaneously. It's the same event, but I watched a reverend priest offer mass. But I also witnessed a bunch of people my age who were really real believers.
The real deal.
and so it was no longer like sort of what I felt or like my personal opinions, but it was this like interesting communal moment.
We need this, and then we need this.
Right. The horizontal and the vertical. And I think
both.
Looking back, for me, the church that I grew up in, despite your best efforts, which were real, because you have always been a woman of prayer, was that vertical dimension. That I had existed in an entirely horizontal world, which ultimately just turns you into a kind of narcissist, I think. That was my experience of it. And so then John Paul II becomes a real intellectual and theological and spiritual father for me, right? A real giant. So any sort of last sort of thoughts on John Paul II, just like what he managed to do, just as you look at the church, not just you personally, but looking at the church.
Well,
why was he so significant?
Because he taught the truth. He was pastoral. He was loving, but he taught the truth. And somewhere somebody said, truth without love is cruelty. Love without truth is sentimentality.
Wow.
And he struck, I think, that perfect balance of love and truth. And I know people are kind of going back and,
relitigating him.
Yeah. But
I don't think it's fair, personally.
we know things now that were not known then.
Yeah.
And you can't go back in history. In order to understand what somebody did, you have to understand the historical times they were in, and what they. Now, was he perfect? No, nobody is. Nobody is, but he's a saint. He is a saint.
Yeah, and I think sort of speed run. I think that I always in my head I kind of chop his papacy into kind of three basic parts. There's that first part that is kind of a stabilizing moment where he's pushing back against a lot of the theological and liturgical excesses.
Right.
But then that middle part, he's just the teachings are just so rich, so amazing. Theology of the body, but also Veritatis Splendor, and whatever you can sort of rattle off. These,
and his Evangelium Vitae. Marvelous. Marvelous.
And again, I don't think people fully appreciate how countercultural those things were, not only in terms of the world, but within the church.
Right.
It's such a substantial.
And the catechism.
Right. So finally, the catechism comes out. Right. And so they do it, and I think that ticked off a lot of the theology class. But also, I think that sort of solidified a kind of a firm ground with which to stand upon.
And if you recall, it was it had been written and was in Spanish or a couple of languages, probably Italian.
Interesting.
And not English, because Cardinal Law had somebody translated into inclusive language.
Wow. I didn't realize this. This is Law, the famous spotlight father of Cardinal Law.
Yes. And here again, look, I think Cardinal Law is being overjudged. I mean, look, I don't agree with everything I did. I think he made some serious errors in judgment. But here again, you're going back in time with the knowledge we have now, and you're judging it. But anyway, it was completely wrong for him to get it translated into inclusive language. And the Vatican said, no, you can't. You can't. You have to retranslate this, which was a good thing. But I remember just waiting for that to come out, just wanting it to come out.
Why?
And because then you had something to stand on.
Why? Because you would be getting in arguments, conversations.
Or people would just, would be.
That's not what the church teaches. That's not the spirit of the council.
And this gave us something to stand on, and I liked what Amy Wellborn had to say. The attitude of the professional, some of them, not all of them, but the attitude of the special. Of the professional Catholic class toward it. I remember, and you know who he is. I won't say his name. It was the principal of your high school.
Yep.
And I was buying the catechism, and he was there, and he said, "Well, tell me about it." He said, "You read it for me and tell me if I need to know anything." Yeah. And I was like, "Oh my Lord,
You're the principal of a major school."
He was a great principal. He was a good principal, but that was his attitude.
Well, that was the kind of attitude, right? Is that we kind of sorted these things out. I don't know what this is for, really, in the end.
Yeah.
All right. Well, sort of to land the plane here, I wanted to just as you look back on it, right? So in my lifetime, technically, I'm born in the reign of Paul VI. John Paul I, then this lengthy John Paul II papacy, followed by Benedict XVI, then his resignation, and then Pope Francis. And I think both of us are surprised. At least what I was most surprised by in terms of the Francis pontificate is all of these things that I thought had really gone the way of the dodo bird come back, just rush back, right? And so that's been an interesting thing to live through. Maybe a level of complacency had kind of come in for me and for all of us, maybe. So obviously, Pope Leo was elevated last month as in terms of this recording of our podcast here, and we'll see, what happens with him. So I don't really want to get into that so much, but so I'm 52.
Yeah.
So my entire life has been lived in this post-conciliar period. I have my own children I'm trying to raise and to raise Catholic. It's the most important thing for me, and I pray for my kids every day, that they take to the faith and all that sort of thing. But just looking back on this conciliar period, I mean, what is your sort of your assessment at this point?
Well, it's a time of tremendous upheaval. It's a time where somebody said we're entering into a time where unless you're willing to be a martyr, you're not going to make it. That doesn't mean we'll all be martyred, but we have to recognize that we have to take our faith seriously, and it has to be the most serious thing in our life.
The most important thing.
The most important thing in our life. And I think that I won't see it, but I think you will see a kind of coming back to the faith that we've already had, we've always had. A lot of this confusion and ambiguity will be cast aside. It will the dust will settle. And it will be easier in a sense to know what the church teaches and live it. It's easier to do something when you know for sure that's what you have to do. It's harder when it's it's this, it's that. It could be that makes it much harder.
Right, because so much of it in my lifetime, has been experienced as casual. The word casual keeps coming back to my mind, but so much of it has been unclear. Not so much for me personally, but in terms of it being the most important thing. I look back on this period of time, and much of it I was very young, as one of I feel like it was really naive. I feel like that there were forces in the church that were malignant, sure, but I feel like that a lot of it was done in a kind of misplaced optimism over, let's just change everything and kind of see what happens. And I wonder, if the headiness, that optimism that you talked about being a college freshman at Loyola in 1962, was misplaced somehow.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. Yeah. We realize how elusive these things can be.
Right.
Right.
Right. And you mess with things eternal, and it shouldn't be surprised that a mess was made.
Right.
To quote Pope Francis, remember, he wasn't making a comment; he was saying, "Make a mess."
Yeah.
And I think that was probably ill-considered. Let's be charitable here. Well, Mom, this has been a treat. Thank you so much for coming on. Well, perhaps we'll have to do this again, but I really want to thank you for coming on.
Okay. Well, I just hope and pray that the things that I shared will help some, at least.
Well, no, but I think sort of you witnessed it all, sort of to sort of have gone through it all is an important thing. So thank you so much. All right, thanks guys. We'll see you next time. Cheers, and we are out. All right. Okay.
That was great.
Yeah,
I hope it's all right.
Oh no, that was fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I even kind of forgot.